Why do we believe what we believe? Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy, a channel aimed at intelligent people wanting to discuss important issues facing life and society. My name is Crispin, and today I want to discuss ideology. That is, an interpretation of the world through a series of heuristics that allows us to simplify and interpret various problems and challenges. Every one of us at some point seeks to answer three fundamental questions. Number one, why do bad things happen in the world? If we look at injustice, unfairness, crisis, disparity, poverty, starvation, why do these things happen? Number two, how do we make the world a better place? What would be the best thing we could do to make the most number of people as happy and as successful as possible? And number three, what's it all for? What is the meaning of life and the human condition? Now, that third question is dominated by spirituality, religion, philosophy, those kinds of ideals. And although many of those can be converted into an ideology, so we see this with fundamental Islam, various types of Nietzschean philosophies, existentialism, for example, and so on. But political ideologies dominate those first two. Why do things happen that are bad? And how do we make more things that happen that are good? We all need ideologies because the world is complex. So having causal explanations for things helps us function in an everyday world. But there are serious problems with this as well. First of all, not all ideologies are equal. Some are very dark. And secondly, ideologies are only useful when worn lightly. That is, it's your first intuition, your first bias. But unless you can personally articulate where your ideology gives way to other things, then you are not actually trying to promote the best common good or minimize harm. You're actually just subscribing to a dogma, okay? And I'll give some examples to illustrate these points. So for example, Marxism, communism, is the belief that you can divide the world into oppressors and oppressed. The bourgeoisie, the capital classes, those that own the means of production, dominating and enslaving the proletariat, those that actually provide the labor and produce all the valuable goods, right? It's through that exploitative relationship, so-called, that explains the unfairness and inequality that happens in the world. And in the communist utopia, everybody becomes proletariat, everybody according to their need and everyone contributing to their capacity. Of course, in reality, it has never worked out that way, because when you divide people up into various characteristics in their collective group identity and you turn them from, shared citizen with common innate human value to the other, the oppressor, then you can dehumanize them in terrible ways. It also, by attributing people's ability to produce goods and have wealth purely to their exploitation of others, it legitimizes seizing their property, right? So if we look at the kulaks of the 20th century, peasant farmers, basically, who had managed to produce a surplus of food for the market, well, of course, communism came along, collectivized all the farms, gave all the property to their so-called proletariat, people who had no idea how to produce food, and the result was a terrible famine in which at least 6 to 8 million people perished. We can see other ideologies as well, liberal ideologies. And for example, I generally subscribe to a liberal ideology wherein people are to be treated as individuals. They should have the maximal freedom allowable, freedom from influence by the state, able to make their own decisions and choices, able to start businesses and contribute and make decisions for themselves in everyday lives with a minimal amount of interference. But as I said at the beginning, there are problems with subscribing to that in a dogmatic way. If we didn't have speed limits on the roads, there'd be a hell of a lot more death and destruction as people were making decisions for themselves that ultimately harmed other people. We have restrictions on ability to take other people's property, restrictions on whether or not it's legitimate to overturn an election. These kinds of circumscriptions of individual freedom is necessary in order to properly regulate society. So while I have liberalism as my default, I recognize the limitations of that philosophy. The worst common ideology that we see in the West, and unfortunately at the moment it is dominant, is what I would refer to as wokeism. And wokeism is a terrible combination of communism and fascism. So fascism in the 20th century was a hierarchy based on race, derived from Charles Darwin's theories of evolution, a real perversion of that theory. His theory was that you would have natural mutations. Some of those mutations would be beneficial, allowing you to outcompete and adapt to your environment, which would allow you to have an advantage when it came to reproduction success and perpetuate that deviation down the line, creating new species. Well, the theory in social Darwinism that led to this fascist ideology was that the races of different humans, so whether you're white, African, Asian, or whatever, were locked in an eternal struggle for dominance in a rigid hierarchy. And that unless one race became the dominant race of the other races, then they would ultimately be defeated by those other races. And that this led to the horrors of the early part of the 20th century, not least of which is the Holocaust. So wokeism is, as I said, a combination of fascism and communism. It's communism in that it divides people into oppressors and oppressed. If you are a cisgender, white, heterosexual male, you are an oppressor. You're dominating other groups, benefiting from so-called privilege in patriarchy, in a power dynamic. And if you don't recognize this, according to this ideology, it's either because you're benefiting from that privilege and you don't want it to change, or you're so absorbed in your oppressive status that it's impossible for you to see the water that you're swimming in every day. And that there is an intersectional hierarchy of oppressors, not just between two groups of, bourgeoisie and proletariat, but it goes all the way down the line. So if you're a white woman, for example, well, you're both oppressor and oppressed. You're oppressor because you're white and have white privilege, but you're oppressed because you're a woman in a patriarchal society. So at the very bottom of the heap in this ideology is, trans women of color, right? Where they've got none of the so-called oppressor characteristics and all of the victimhood points that come with their status. And we are actually lionizing that to a degree, which is why so many young people are desperate to be in that victimhood group, elevating the victim to heroic status in our modern culture. But it's also fascism, because unlike communism, which at least in theory, though never in practice, was open to everybody, everyone could through enough work become proletariat. Well, this is based on your immutable racial characteristics. You can't change the fact that you're white. It's debatable, of course, without getting into political trans discussions over sex. There is a lot of it's based upon who you are as a person, and just like with Nazi Germany, where even if you were a Jew who converted to Christianity, the Nazis would say, well, no, that doesn't matter. This is innate to who you are. You are innately Jewish, regardless of your personal worldview, and that makes you less than a true human being in their eyes. So wokeism has exactly the same structure, right? You are either a oppressor class, but based upon immutable characteristics, combining both communism and fascism in the worst possible way. But I want to, despite my condemnation here, I do want to be a little bit more generous to these people, because they are, like all of us, seeking to answer these fundamental questions that I said at the outset. Why do bad things happen in the world? And how do we improve things to make it as good for everybody? And in the woke worldview, bad things are happening in the world because there's white privilege and patriarchy, and we make the world a better place by smashing all of those institutions, silencing the cisgender white males, changing the current paradigm power structures such that the victimhood groups now dominate and inherit our institutions. Like every other time that something like this has been tried in history, the consequences are going to be terrible. But having an ideology itself is not inherently bad. The way to manage it is to ensure that you understand what it is and can articulate it, but also, as I've said before, explain its limitations. Where do things go wrong? So let's say a new issue comes up. Should we regulate gambling? Just a random question out of the sky. Well, as a libertarian, liberal kind of individual, my ideology is that people should be able to do whatever they like, right? But then the practical implications of that, are there any circumstances in which gambling might be restricted or banned? Of course there should be, okay? Why? Because my ideology is not something I subscribe to as a writ dogma. It's a heuristic I apply as a bias within various challenges and provide a litmus test against which other practical solutions might outweigh that benefit. So what I recommend to each of you is being aware, self-aware about the ideology and value system that you have, explaining why bad things happen in the world and how we would make the world a better place. But then for your own critical thinking and self-development, ask yourself, where does this ideology fall down? Where's the boundary to be applied? And if you can articulate that well, then you will be able to gradually move towards a more practical and pragmatic worldview that will actually begin to solve some of the practical problems. That's my view on this. Hopefully you found value in this discussion. It's a kind of a complex subject. I'd really appreciate to hear your thoughts. If you haven't already, like and subscribe. We talk about these important subjects a lot, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you so much. Bye.